August 15th, 1945. The sky above Tokyo glowed with the pale light of early morning. Ensign Wright C. Hobbs sat in the cockpit of his Grumman F-6F Hellcat, feeling the engine vibrate through the metal frame beneath him. Salt air from the Pacific mixed with engine exhaust. His hands rested on the control stick. Below, the USS Yorktown rolled gently in the swells. This would be his last mission before promotion to lieutenant. He did not know it would be his last mission ever. Hobbs was 22 years old from Indiana and believed he was born to fly fighter planes like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. In the cockpit beside him, on the flight deck, sat 3 other men. Lieutenant Howard Harrison from Sutton, West Virginia, wanted to reunite with his wife and see the baby daughter who was born after he left for the Pacific. Ensign Eugene Manderberg, who before the war was a reporter from Detroit, saw aviation more as a wartime duty, something to be set aside before returning to the newsroom once the conflict ended. Ensign Joseph Saloff from Selkirk, New York, wanted to prove that he could fly with the best. They were all part of Air Group 88, stationed aboard one of the Navy's principal carriers. They had flown together for months. They trusted each other with their lives. Admiral William F. Halsey had given the order to launch carrier strikes on the Tokyo area on the morning of August 15th, 1945, to maintain unremitting pressure on the Japanese, as he was directed, even as surrender negotiations were ongoing. The atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everyone knew the war was nearly over, but until official orders came to stand down, the fighting continued. The pressure had to remain constant. No one wanted to be the last man to die in a war that was already won, but someone always is. The mission that morning was straightforward. Hellcats flown by Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg, and Saloff would target enemy aircraft at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo to clear a path for bombers and torpedo planes that would follow with a strike on nearby factories. It was a sweet mission. Find enemy planes on the ground or in the air, destroy them, come home. They had done it dozens of times before, but this morning was different. Harrison's team was not even scheduled to fly a mission on August 15th. But the flight leader knew that Hobbs needed one more mission to receive a promotion to lieutenant, so he asked to switch his team with the pilots scheduled to lift off that day to ensure his comrade's promotion. That single decision changed everything. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was not the fastest fighter in the Pacific. It was not the most maneuverable, but it was the most effective. The F-6F was powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same power plant used for both the Corsair and the United States Army Air Force's Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The engine was a twin-row radial, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 circles around a central crankshaft. Each cylinder was the size of a man's fist. The engine weighed over a ton, but produced power that shook the entire airframe when it roared to life. The Hellcat was a pilot's airplane. One pilot described the F-6F as an outstanding fighter plane that performed well, was easy to fly, and was a stable gun platform. But what he really remembered most was that it was rugged and easy to maintain. In the hands of a trained pilot, the Hellcat could hold its own against any enemy fighter in the sky. Its 650 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, 3 on each side. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. When all 6 guns fired at once, the sound was like tearing canvas magnified 1,000 times. The recoil slowed the aircraft in mid-air. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to counter the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero was lighter, more agile, could turn tighter circles and climb faster at low speeds. But it had weaknesses. The lightly armored Zeros were no match for the Hellcat's rugged construction and 6 50 caliber guns. The Hellcat had armor plating around the cockpit, a bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. A Zero pilot who got a burst into a Hellcat might see his rounds spark off armor. A Hellcat pilot who got a burst into a Zero would see it disintegrate. American and British Hellcats would claim the destruction of 5 out of 203 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific and 13 German aircraft in Europe for a loss of only 270 F-6Fs. This amounted to a kill-loss ratio of 19-1. Hellcat's advantages came from American industrial philosophy. It was not designed to be perfect. It was designed to be good enough and to be produced in overwhelming numbers. In just 30 months, 12,275 Hellcats were produced by Grumman at its Bethpage Plant No. 3, much of the factory still being constructed as production began. The aircraft could be assembled quickly, maintained easily, and repaired in the field with basic tools. Parts were standardized. Damaged aircraft could be cannibalized to keep others flying. This was not elegant engineering. It was pragmatic engineering. It was the kind of engineering that wins wars. The pilots of Air Group 88 knew their aircraft intimately. They knew the sound the engine made when it was running rich or lean. They knew how the stick felt when the aircraft was near a stall. They knew the vibration that meant a gun had jammed. They knew these things because their lives depended on knowing them. In aerial combat, there is no time to consult a manual. Everything must be instinct. On the morning of August 15, 1945, the 4 Hellcats launched from the Yorktown just after dawn. The catapult shot them forward with crushing force. The deck fell away beneath them. The horizon tilted. Then they were airborne, climbing into the pale sky over the Pacific. The radio crackled with routine traffic, weather reports, bearing updates, nothing unusual. They formed up and headed west toward Japan. Despite the atomic bombings, the brass continued to order Air Group 88 into danger, even though the war's end seemed imminent as Japan teetered on the brink of collapse. Until a formal surrender was announced, the US Navy would continue to attack with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The strategy was simple and brutal. Keep hitting them until they surrender. Give them no respite, no moment to regroup or reconsider, just constant, unrelenting pressure. It was a strategy that cost lives, but it was believed to save more lives than it cost by shortening the war. On August 14th, with another mission scheduled for the following day, aviator Maurice Proctor confided to his diary his fears and prayers that the war would end that night. When the chaplain brought word that negotiations continued and strikes would proceed, the somber reality set in. This was the mood among the pilots. They were exhausted. They had seen friends die. They had seen aircraft explode and spin into the sea. They had seen parachutes that never opened and men who never came back. They wanted it to be over. Everyone wanted it to be over. The flight toward Tokyo took nearly 2 hours. The 4 Hellcats flew in loose formation, conserving fuel, scanning the sky for enemy aircraft. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly. Then the coastline appeared. Mountains, rice fields, roads, the sprawl of Tokyo in the distance. Lieutenant Henry J. O'Meara marveled to see a Tokyo plain so thickly studded with airfields that 10 or a dozen were visible from almost any point. This was the heart of the Japanese Empire. This was enemy territory. The 8 VF-88 Hellcats were to split into 2 groups at Tokurazama Airfield, northwest of Tokyo. 2 pilots would stay high to receive and relay any ceasefire message while the rest, including Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg and Saloff, would attack. The plan was simple. Hit the airfield, destroy any aircraft on the ground, engage any enemy fighters that rose to meet them, then return to the carrier. Standard strike mission. They had done it before. But as they approached the target, something happened that changed everything. As the strikes were on their way in, Halsey received word that the Japanese had officially accepted the Allies' terms for surrender, and a recall order was broadcast. The war was over. The message came over the radio in the middle of their approach. The war was over. Turn around. Dump your ordnance in the ocean. Come home. It was over. The relief must have been overwhelming. They had survived. They would see their families again. Hobbs would get his promotion. Harrison would meet his daughter. Manderberg would return to his typewriter. Saloff would prove he belonged. They were going home. Harrison's 6 Hellcats were low over Tokurazama at 6:45 a.m. when they got the ceasefire news. Decades later, Ted Hansen, who had been flying on Maury Proctor's wing, told an interviewer that he recalled thinking that everyone needed to get out of there immediately. Harrison led the flight in a quick circle around the enemy airfield and started on the journey back to Yorktown. They turned east. They began the long flight back to the carrier. The war was over. They had survived. In a few hours they would be back on the Yorktown. They would celebrate. They would write letters home. They would sleep without fear for the first time in months. But not everyone had received the message. Not everyone knew the war was over. Or perhaps they knew and did not care. Perhaps they wanted one last fight. Perhaps they had orders to ignore the surrender. Perhaps they simply could not accept defeat. Seconds later, 17 Japanese fighters, Kawanishi George and Nakajima Franks along with Zeros and Jacks, assailed the Americans from behind and above. The attack came without warning. One moment the sky was empty. The next it was full of enemy aircraft. They dove from above, from out of the sun, the oldest trick in aerial combat. The Japanese pilots opened fire immediately. Tracers streaked through the air. The radio erupted with shouts. Enemy fighters! Brake right! Brake left! Guns blazing. The peaceful morning sky over Tokyo transformed into chaos. With multiple enemy aircraft speeding towards them, each aviator selected the first target they spotted. Harrison and Hobbs pursued a pair, while Manderberg and Saloff peeled off in their own attacks. Training took over. There was no time to think, only to react. Select a target, get on his tail, lead him, fire. The Hellcats were outnumbered more than 3-1, 17 Japanese fighters against 6 American aircraft. But the Americans had advantages: better armor, more firepower, superior training. Their training paid dividends immediately when, in the opening minutes of the dogfight, the group shot down 4 opponents. 4 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in flames. But the numbers were against them. For every enemy aircraft destroyed, there were 3 more. The Japanese pilots pressed the attack with desperate fury. They knew they were fighting after the surrender. Perhaps that made them more dangerous. They had nothing left to lose. An enemy fighter jumped onto Saloff's tail, pumping bullets into the Hellcat. With his plane streaming smoke, Saloff made for the open sea. He ducked in and out of clouds and then bailed out before his plane rolled twice and then tumbled earthward. Joseph Saloff from Selkirk, New York, who wanted to prove he could fly with the best, fell through the sky over Tokyo. His parachute opened, but he did not survive. Whether he drowned in Tokyo Bay or was killed by his injuries or captured and executed, no one knows. His body was never recovered. The fight continued. The Japanese turned their attention to Harrison, Hobbs, and Manderberg. One Hellcat exploded, forcing the unidentified pilot to parachute from 7,000 feet, while 2 others, outnumbered by the Japanese, quickly plummeted in flames and smashed into the ground. 3 more American pilots fell from the sky: Wright C. Hobbs from Indiana, Eugene Manderberg from Detroit, Howard Harrison from West Virginia. They died in the opening moments of peace. They had taken off in wartime and were shot down in peacetime. They died knowing the war was over. That knowledge must have been unbearable. The wild fight over Tokorozama, World War II's last substantial air battle, interwove victory, tragedy, and irony. The 6 VF-88 aviators battled harsh odds to claim 9 kills, but at the cost of 4 missing and finally presumed dead: Howdy Harrison, Hybrid Hobbs, Gene Mandenberg, and Joe Saloff. They shot down 9 enemy aircraft, more than one for each American pilot in the fight. But 4 of them never came home. The mathematics of aerial combat are brutal and simple. You can win the fight and still lose everything. Back on the USS Yorktown, the mood shifted from celebration to horror in minutes. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, but 4 of their pilots were missing. 4 men who had been alive that morning were now gone. The radio crackled with emergency calls. Search and rescue operations launched immediately. Aircraft scoured the area where the fight had occurred. They found wreckage. They found oil slicks on the water. They found nothing else. The Japanese pilots who shot them down also died that day. The fallen on both sides died in the opening moments of peace. They were warriors who could not stop fighting even when the war had ended. They were men trapped by duty and honor and orders that came too late or not at all. History does not record their names. They remain anonymous, known only as the enemy pilots in the last dogfight of World War II. The irony was almost too much to bear. Fleet Admiral William F. Halsey recorded these 4 names in his memoirs and asked that they should never be forgotten. Halsey had given the order that sent them into the sky that morning. He had to live with that decision for the rest of his life. Historians later presented him as a 2-fold commander, able and energetic when the nation most needed aggressive leadership in 1942 and 1943, but sometimes indecisive and overly aggressive in the final years of the war. The decision to continue offensive operations on the morning of August 15, 1945, was not made lightly. Admiral King in Washington, D.C., and Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific issued orders to Halsey and his subordinates to keep applying pressure on the Japanese to bring the war to an end. The logic was straightforward. Until the Japanese formally surrendered, the war continued. Every moment of hesitation might allow them to change their minds. Every pause might give them time to regroup. The pressure had to remain constant until the very end. Admiral Radford later regretted that he didn't convince others to delay offensive operations during the final days of the war. But regret changes nothing. The dead remain dead. The question that haunts military historians is whether those 4 men needed to die. Could the missions have been delayed by just a few hours? Could the recall order have been sent earlier? Could anything have been different? The answer is probably no. War operates on its own logic. Decisions are made with incomplete information. Orders are given and followed, men die. The machinery of war does not stop instantly just because someone signs a piece of paper in a distant capital. There is momentum. There is inertia. There are men in aircraft flying toward targets who cannot simply turn around and pretend nothing happened. War ends slowly, in fits and starts, with final casualties that seem more tragic because they were so close to being unnecessary. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat that carried these men into their last fight was a masterpiece of American industrial design. It was not beautiful. It was blunt and heavy, with a wide fuselage and stubby wings. But it was effective. During the course of World War II, 2,000 from 162 F-6F Hellcats were lost to all causes. 270 in aerial combat, 553 to anti-aircraft ground and shipboard fire, and 341 due to operational causes. Of the total figure, 1,298 were destroyed in training and ferry operations, normally outside of the combat zones. These numbers reveal something important. More Hellcats were lost in training than in combat. The aircraft was difficult to master, but forgiving once mastered. It required skill, but rewarded competence. The Hellcat's dominance in the Pacific theater came from a combination of factors: superior tactics, better training, overwhelming numbers, but also from the aircraft itself. Late in the war, the Navy conducted evaluations of Allied and captured Axis fighters. The Hellcat ranked at the top in most categories, making it one of the best fighters in the war. An amazing accomplishment considering the very short design to production period. From prototype to operational deployment took only 18 months. This was engineering under pressure. This was design by necessity. This was the American way of making war. The contrast with Japanese aircraft design philosophy was stark. The Zero was built for performance. It was light, agile, could outclimb and outturn almost anything in the sky. But it achieved this performance by sacrificing everything else. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armament. A single burst of fire could set it ablaze. Japanese pilots called them flying cigarette lighters. American pilots learned to use energy tactics. Dive on the Zero from above. Fire. Climb away using speed and power the Zero could not match. Never try to turn with a Zero. Use the Hellcat's strengths against the Zero's weaknesses. This was the tactical evolution that defined the Pacific Air War. In 1942, American pilots tried to dogfight Zeros on equal terms and died. By 1943, they had learned better tactics. By 1944, they had aircraft like the Hellcat that could execute those tactics effectively. By 1945, the air war over the Pacific was essentially over. American aircraft dominated the skies. Japanese pilots, no matter how skilled or brave, were overwhelmed by numbers and technology and tactics they could not counter. But on August 15, 1945, in the skies over Tokyo, none of that mattered. 4 American pilots died in a dogfight that never should have happened. They died after the war had ended. They died because the machinery of war does not stop instantly. They died because information travels slower than aircraft. They died because some Japanese pilots either did not know or did not care that their country had surrendered. The bodies of 3 of the 4 pilots were never recovered. Joseph Saloff, Wright C. Hobbs, Howard Harrison. They fell into Tokyo Bay or crashed on land somewhere near the city. Their families never had a chance to bury them. The remains of Eugene Manderberg were recovered as his Hellcat crashed on land. He was the only one of the 4 who came home, though not the way anyone wanted. The families of these men received telegrams. Regret to inform you, missing in action, presumed dead. The telegrams arrived while the nation was celebrating victory. Streets were filled with people dancing and cheering. The war was over. We had won, but for 4 families in Indiana and Detroit and West Virginia and New York, the war would never be over. Their sons and husbands and fathers were gone. They died on the last day. They almost made it home. In VF-88's scant month of combat, the unit lost 10 aviators. For all of Air Group 88, including men lost during training, the tally was 31. These numbers seem small compared to the overall casualties of World War II. Millions died in that war. What are 4 more? But each death is absolute. Each family's grief is total. There is no consolation in statistics. The story of the last dogfight of World War II is not a story of heroism. It is not a story of triumph. It is a story of tragedy and waste and the bitter randomness of war. It is a story about men who did their duty and died for it, even though the war was already over. It is a story about orders followed and missions flown and the terrible gap between decision and outcome. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat continued to serve after the war. Following the war, Hellcats were utilized for Naval Reserve fighter squadrons. In 1946, the aircraft became the first to fly with the Blue Angels flight exhibition team. Some were converted to drones, others were used for training, but by the 1950s they were obsolete. Jets had taken over. The propeller-driven fighter belonged to history. Museums collected them. Veterans remembered them. But the war they had been built for was long over. Today, only a handful of Hellcats remain in flyable condition. They appear at air shows, their radial engines roaring, blue smoke trailing from their exhausts. People watch them fly and applaud. But most of the people watching were not born when these aircraft ruled the Pacific skies. They do not remember what it was like when hundreds of Hellcats launched from carrier decks to sweep the Japanese from the air. They do not remember what it felt like to know that every flight might be your last. They do not remember because they were not there. The pilots who flew Hellcats in combat are almost all gone now. The last few are in their 90s or older. Soon there will be no one left who remembers. The war will pass from living memory into history. The stories will remain, but they will become abstract. Numbers and dates and places. The human reality will fade. The fear and exhaustion and grief will become difficult to imagine. But the story of August 15th, 1945 should not fade. It should not be forgotten. 4 men died that day in a dogfight that occurred after the war had ended. They died because war is chaos, and information is imperfect, and young men follow orders, even when those orders send them to their deaths. They died because someone had to be last. In every war, someone is always last. The strategic context of that final mission reveals the complex calculus of military command. Admiral Halsey was operating under direct orders from Washington and from Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific. Halsey kept sending out missions against Japanese airfields and other targets because he wanted to keep the pressure on them to come to the peace table. This was not cruelty. This was not incompetence. This was strategic logic. The atomic bombs had been dropped. The Japanese government was debating surrender. But until they formally accepted terms, the war continued. Any pause might be interpreted as weakness. Any hesitation might allow the hardliners in Tokyo to regain control. The pilots understood this logic even as they hated it. War weariness became evident at the start of August 1945 and intensified once the atom bombs had been employed. Pilots asked themselves, others, and their superiors why they should risk their lives when the war was going to end in a few days or even hours. But they flew anyway. They followed orders. They did their duty. That is what soldiers do. The technological superiority of American forces by August 1945 was overwhelming. The Japanese Air Force was a shadow of what it had been. Experienced pilots were dead. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft were obsolete. But they still fought. The 17 Japanese fighters that attacked the Americans were described as Kawanishi George and Nakajima Franks, along with Zeros and Jacks. These were first-line aircraft flown by skilled pilots. They were not kamikaze suicide attackers. They were professional fighter pilots engaging in conventional aerial combat. They shot down 4 American aircraft in a brief, violent fight. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of surrender. When does a war actually end? When politicians sign documents? When orders reach the front lines? When the last shot is fired? The Japanese government accepted the Allied surrender terms on August 15th, 1945. But Japanese pilots were still fighting that morning. American pilots were still dying. The war was officially over, but the killing continued. This is the reality of war. It does not end cleanly. It does not stop all at once. It bleeds out slowly, with final casualties that seem especially tragic because they came so close to being avoided. The Hellcat that Wright C. Hobbs flew that morning was a machine designed for a specific purpose. Kill enemy aircraft, protect friendly bombers, survive long enough to return to the carrier and fight again tomorrow. Every design decision reflected this purpose. The big radial engine provided power for speed and climbing. The armor plating protected the pilot from ground fire and enemy bullets. The 6 machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. The wide landing gear made carrier landings safer. Every pound of weight was justified. Every system had a purpose. This quality of ruggedness and maintainability mattered enormously. Aircraft carriers are harsh environments. Salt air corrodes metal. Constant motion strains airframes. Maintenance must be performed quickly, often under combat conditions. An aircraft that requires specialized tools or rare parts is useless. The Hellcat could be maintained by ordinary mechanics with standard tools. Parts were interchangeable. Damaged aircraft could be repaired using parts from other damaged aircraft. This unglamorous practicality made the Hellcat more effective than more sophisticated designs. The story of the last dogfight of World War II is ultimately a story about the gap between policy and reality. Politicians and generals can declare a war over. They can sign documents and issue orders, but they cannot instantly communicate those orders to every soldier and sailor in the field. They cannot control what happens in the minutes or hours before those orders arrive. They cannot prevent the last few deaths that occur after the war is officially over, but before everyone knows it. The 4 pilots who died on August 15, 1945, died in that gap. They died between the announcement of surrender and the cessation of hostilities. They died in the confusion and chaos of war's ending. They died because information travels at the speed of radio waves, but violence travels at the speed of aircraft and bullets. They died because the machinery of war has momentum that cannot be stopped instantly. The newest Yorktown had deployed so recently that its airmen and sailors remained in the Pacific until October 1945. Only then did the Fighting Lady sail for San Francisco. When the carrier finally returned home, the nation had already moved on. The war was over. Veterans were coming home by the thousands. The celebration had faded. The work of peace had begun. The men of Air Group 88 returned to a country that barely remembered they had been fighting. Their war had lasted only 1 month of actual combat operations, but in that month they had lost 10 pilots, 10 men who would never come home. The families of the 4 men killed on August 15, 1945, received little recognition. According to author John Wukowitz, the 4 men were the last killed in the line of duty during World War II, having gone up in wartime but killed in a time of peace. This distinction is cold comfort. Dead is dead. Whether you die on the first day of the war or the last day makes no difference to your family. But there is something particularly cruel about dying after the war has ended. There is no larger purpose to redeem the loss. There is no victory to justify the sacrifice. There is only waste and bad timing and the terrible randomness of fate. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was retired from frontline service shortly after the war ended. Jets were faster. They were more powerful. They were the future. The Hellcat belonged to the past. But for a brief period, from 1943 to 1945, the Hellcat was the dominant fighter in the Pacific theater. Hellcats were credited with destroying a total of 5,223 enemy aircraft, while in service with the US Navy, US Marine Corps, and Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. This was more than any other Allied naval aircraft. That record has never been matched. It likely never will be. The age of propeller-driven fighters ended with World War II. Modern air combat involves missiles fired from beyond visual range. Dogfights are rare. The kind of close-range, turning, burning aerial combat that defined World War II belongs to history. But the lessons of August 15, 1945 remain relevant. War is chaos. Communication is imperfect. Young men die following orders that made sense when they were given, but are obsolete by the time they are executed. The last casualties of any war are the most tragic because they came so close to being avoided. A few hours, a few minutes, a different decision by a distant commander. Any of these might have saved them, but history does not deal in might-have-beens. It deals only in what actually happened. What actually happened on August 15, 1945 was this. 4 American pilots took off from the USS Yorktown on a mission to attack Japanese airfields near Tokyo. While they were in the air, Japan accepted the Allied surrender terms. They were ordered to abort the mission and return to the carrier. On their way back, they were attacked by Japanese fighters, who either did not know the war was over or did not care. In the fight that followed, all 4 American pilots were shot down and killed. They were the last American combat casualties of World War II. They died after the war had ended. They died in the gap between decision and implementation. They died because war does not end cleanly. Their names were Ensign Wright C. Hobbs, Ensign Eugene Manderberg, Lieutenant Howard M. Harrison, Lieutenant Joseph G. Sarloff. They were young men with families and futures. They had survived months of combat. They were days away from going home. Instead, they died in a dogfight that never should have happened. Their story is not unique. In every war, someone is last. But their story is worth remembering, because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of war. It does not end when we want it to. It does not stop cleanly. It claims its final victims even after the fighting is officially over. The skies over Tokyo on the morning of August 15, 1945, saw the last substantial air battle of World War II. American Hellcats against Japanese fighters. Both sides fought with skill and courage. Both sides suffered casualties. The Americans shot down 9 enemy aircraft. The Japanese shot down 4 American aircraft. In purely tactical terms, the Americans won, but in any terms that actually matter, everyone lost. Men died fighting a war that was already over. They died because information traveled too slowly. They died because some people did not know or did not accept that the war had ended. They died because war is chaos and chaos kills. Today, if you visit the right museums, you can see a Grumman F-6F Hellcat. You can walk around it. You can see the gun ports in the wings. You can see the armor plating behind the pilot's seat. You can see the massive radial engine. You can imagine what it must have been like to fly such a machine into combat. But imagination only goes so far. You cannot truly understand what it was like unless you were there. Unless you felt the aircraft shudder when all 6 guns fired. Unless you saw enemy tracers arc toward your canopy. Unless you watched a friend's aircraft explode and fall from the sky. Unless you knew that every mission might be your last. The men who flew those missions are disappearing. Time claims them the way war once did, but slower and with more dignity. Their memories fade. Their stories become harder to tell. The visceral reality of what they experience becomes abstract. Future generations will read about World War II in textbooks. They will see statistics and maps and timelines. They will learn about strategies and technologies and outcomes. But they will not feel what it was like to be 22 years old in the cockpit of a Hellcat, watching the sun rise over the Pacific, knowing you might not see it set. The last dogfight of World War II lasted only minutes. The entire engagement from first contact to final casualty took less time than it takes to tell the story. But those minutes contained lifetimes. They contained hope and fear and courage and death. They contained the end of one man's dream to see his daughter and another man's ambition to earn his promotion and a third man's desire to return to his typewriter, and a fourth man's need to prove his worth. They contained all of this, and then extinguished it in fire and smoke and falling aircraft. War is often described in grand terms: strategy and tactics, victories and defeats, the sweep of history, the clash of civilizations. But war is not abstract. War is young men like Wright Hobbs and Howard Harrison and Eugene Manderberg and Joseph Saloff climbing into their aircraft on a summer morning and flying towards something they cannot control. War is the moment when information arrives too late. War is the gap between what should happen and what actually happens. War is the terrible mathematics of violence, where winning and losing become meaningless when measured against individual lives. The story of August 15th, 1945, is not a story about technology, though technology played its role. It is not a story about strategy, though strategy set it in motion. It is not even really a story about war, though war provided the context. It is a story about time and chance and the fragile nature of human existence. It is a story about how close we can come to survival and still fall short. It is a story about 4 men who almost made it home, but did not. Fleet Admiral Halsey asked that their names never be forgotten. This was the least he could do. He could not bring them back. He could not change his orders. He could not undo the decisions that sent them into the sky that morning. But he could remember. He could ensure that history recorded their names. He could give them that small immortality that comes from being remembered. And so we remember. Wright C. Hobbs, who wanted to be a lieutenant. Howard Harrison, who wanted to meet his daughter. Eugene Manderberg, who wanted to return to journalism. Joseph Saloff, who wanted to prove himself. 4 men among millions who died in World War II. 4 men who were no more or less important than any of the others. 4 men whose only distinguishing characteristic was that they died last, after the war was over, in a fight that never should have happened. Their deaths changed nothing strategically. The war was already over. Japan had already surrendered. The outcome had already been decided. Their sacrifice did not tip the balance, or enable victory, or achieve any military objective. It was pure waste, pure tragedy, pure randomness, and perhaps that makes their story more important, not less, because it reminds us that war does not end cleanly, that there is no perfect moment when everything stops and everyone goes home safe, that someone is always last, that victory does not erase loss, that even in the final seconds of peace, war finds a way to claim its victims. The sun that rose over Tokyo on August 15th, 1945, rose on a world at peace. But for 4 American pilots and an unknown number of Japanese pilots, that sunrise brought not peace but death. They died in the light of that new day, fighting a war that no longer existed. following orders that had been rescinded, pursuing objectives that no longer mattered. They died because war has its own momentum, because violence does not stop instantly, because the machinery of death, once set in motion, requires time to wind down. And in that time, in those final moments between war and peace, men still die. This is what we must remember. Not just the names, not just the facts, not just the dates and places and aircraft types. We must remember that war is not a switch that can be turned on and off, that it does not end when we decide it should end, that it bleeds and stutters and claims its final victims even after the outcome has been decided. We must remember that someone is always last, and that being last does not make their sacrifice any less real, or their death any less permanent, or their family's grief any less absolute. The Grumman F-6F, Hellcat that carried these men to their deaths, was just a machine. Metal and fuel and ammunition. It had no conscience. It felt no remorse. It simply flew where it was pointed and fought when it was ordered to fight. But the men inside those machines were not machines. They were humans with hopes and fears and families waiting for them. They were individuals with dreams that would never be realized and futures that would never arrive. They were sons and husbands and brothers who left empty chairs at dinner tables and unopened letters in mailboxes and photographs that would yellow with age in frames on mantelpieces. The technology that killed them was not remarkable. Bullets and cannon shells, the same weapons that had killed millions before them, the same physics of velocity and impact and penetration that had been understood for centuries. A piece of metal traveling fast enough to pierce aluminum and flesh, simple, brutal, final. The Hellcat's armor could stop some rounds, but not all. The self-sealing fuel tanks could contain some leaks, but not catastrophic damage. The aircraft could absorb punishment, but not infinite punishment. Eventually, something vital gets hit. The engine stops. The controls fail. The aircraft falls. What it must have felt like in those final moments. The sudden impact of enemy rounds hitting the airframe. The sound of metal tearing. The smell of smoke and fuel. The realization that the aircraft is dying beneath you. The decision to bail out or ride it down. The frantic search for altitude and airspeed and somewhere safe to go. The knowledge that there is no safe place. The enemy fighters still circling. The ground or water rushing up. The last thoughts before impact. Did they think of their families? Did they curse the war? Did they wonder why this was happening when it was supposed to be over? These questions have no answers. The dead cannot tell us what they thought or felt in their final moments. We can only imagine, and perhaps it is better that way. Perhaps some experiences are too terrible to be fully understood by those who did not live them. Perhaps the final moments of a pilot whose aircraft is falling from the sky belong only to that pilot. Private, unknowable, lost forever. What we do know is what happened after. The search and rescue operations that found nothing, the telegrams sent to families, the memorial services held without bodies, the names added to lists of the missing and presumed dead, the slow, painful process of acceptance that these men were not coming home, the decades that followed in which wives grew old alone and daughters grew up without fathers and mothers, never stopped wondering if maybe, somehow, there had been a mistake. War creates these voids, these absences, these empty spaces where people used to be, and the empty spaces last forever. They do not heal. They do not fill in. They remain as permanent reminders of what was lost. Every birthday not celebrated, every Christmas with an empty chair, every graduation and wedding and birth where someone should have been present but was not. The ripple effects of death extend outward in all directions, touching lives that never even met the deceased. Howard Harrison's daughter grew up never knowing her father. She knew him only through photographs and stories told by her mother and other relatives, second-hand memories. Descriptions of a man she never got to meet. She would grow up wondering what he was like, what his voice sounded like, what it would have felt like to be held by him. These are questions that could never be answered. Her father existed for her only as an absence, a negative space, a missing piece in the puzzle of her life. Wright Hobbs never got his promotion to lieutenant. The paperwork was probably filed anyway. A posthumous promotion, a meaningless gesture. What good is rank to a dead man? But perhaps it meant something to his family. Perhaps they took some small comfort in knowing that the Navy recognized his service with a promotion, even if he never lived to wear the new insignia. Perhaps it helped them believe that his death had meaning, that it counted for something, that it was not just waste. Eugene Manderberg never filed another story. His typewriter sat silent. The words he would have written remained unwritten. The stories he would have told remained untold. He had survived the war as a reporter and then died as a pilot in a fight that should never have happened. The irony is almost unbearable. He had seen combat from the safety of a newsroom and then experienced it firsthand in the most violent way possible. If he had lived, what would he have written about that final mission? What words would he have found to describe flying toward home believing you were safe, only to be attacked by an enemy that refused to accept defeat? Joseph Saloff never proved himself, or perhaps he did. Perhaps the mere fact of being there, of flying the mission, of engaging the enemy even when outnumbered, was proof enough. Perhaps his final moments in combat, fighting against impossible odds, demonstrated all the courage and skill and determination anyone could ask for. But he never knew it. He died believing he still had something to prove, and now he is remembered not for what he accomplished, but for how he died. Last among the last, the Japanese pilots who fought that morning remain nameless. History did not record who they were or why they attacked. Were they rogue pilots acting on their own? Were they following orders from commanders who refused to accept the surrender? Were they simply men who could not stop fighting? The answers died with them. They fell from the sky over Tokyo, just like the Americans they shot down. Their families received their own telegrams. Their empty chairs surrounded their own dinner tables. War does not discriminate in its grief. The fact that both sides suffered losses in this final fight adds another layer of tragedy. If the Japanese pilots had not attacked, everyone would have survived. If the American pilots had taken a different route home, they might have avoided the encounter. If the recall message had been sent 10 minutes earlier, or the fighters had been 10 minutes faster returning to the carrier, none of this would have happened. The entire incident depended on a precise and terrible alignment of timing and location and decision-making that resulted in the worst possible outcome. This is the nature of war. It creates situations where small differences in timing or position or information result in life or death. A pilot who takes off 5 minutes earlier survives while the pilot behind him dies. A slight change in course means missing an enemy patrol. A faster response to a warning means escaping an ambush. But we never know which decisions will matter until after they have been made. We cannot see the future. We make the best choices we can with the information we have, and sometimes those choices kill us. The men who made it back to the USS Yorktown that morning carried the weight of survival. They had flown the same mission as Harrison and Hobbs and Manderberg and Saloff. They had faced the same enemy fighters. They had been in the same fight, but they survived and their friends did not. This is survivor's guilt. The gnawing question of why me and not them. The inability to find a reason or logic to explain who lives and who dies in combat. It is random. It is chance. But humans need meaning. We need to believe that outcomes happen for reasons, and when we cannot find reasons, we create them. We tell ourselves we were better or luckier or more deserving, but none of it is true. We survived because of 1,000 tiny factors beyond our control, and they died for the same reason. The men of Air Group 88 would carry this guilt for the rest of their lives. They would dream about that morning. They would replay the fight in their minds. They would wonder what they could have done differently. Could they have warned their friends faster? Could they have engaged more enemy fighters? Could they have done something, anything to change the outcome? The answer is probably no. Once the fight started, once the Japanese attacked, the outcome was largely determined by position and numbers and luck. But knowing this intellectually does not ease the emotional burden. The heart does not care about logic. The Yorktown sailed on. The war was over. The carrier would eventually return to the United States. Life would continue. New pilots would be trained. New missions would be flown. The Navy would transition from war to peace. The enormous fleets assembled to defeat Japan would be reduced. Carriers would be mothballed. Aircraft would be scrapped or sold. The massive industrial machine that had produced thousands of Hellcats would retool for civilian production. The men who had served would return to civilian life. They would find jobs and start families, and try to forget what they had seen and done. But they would never forget. August 15th, 1945. They would never forget the 4 empty bunks in the quarters they shared. They would never forget the sound of enemy fighters diving out of the sun. They would never forget the radio calls from pilots in trouble. They would never forget watching their friends fall from the sky. These memories would stay with them forever, sharp and painful, impossible to dislodge. The passage of time does not heal all wounds. Some wounds remain open forever. The loss of a friend in combat is that kind of wound. It never truly heals. You learn to live with it. You learn to carry it. But it never goes away. Every August 15th for the rest of their lives, The survivors of that fight would remember. They would think about what happened. They would wonder about what could have been. They would feel the weight of survival pressing down on them. The families of the fallen would also never forget. How could they? The war might have ended, but their war continued. The war against grief and absence and loss. This war has no victory. There is no peace treaty to sign. There is only the daily struggle to continue living when someone you love is gone. To find meaning in a world that suddenly seems meaningless. To build a future when the future you had planned was destroyed. The United States moved forward after World War II with remarkable speed. The economy boomed. The population grew. Cities expanded. Technology advanced. The country that emerged from the war was stronger and richer and more powerful than the country that entered it. America had won. The cost had been high, but the victory was complete. Japan was defeated. Germany was defeated. The fascist powers were destroyed. Democracy and freedom had triumphed. This was the narrative. This was the story the nation told itself. But for the families of Wright Hobbs and Howard Harrison and Eugene Manderberg and Joseph Sarloff, the victory was hollow. What did triumph matter when their loved ones were dead? What did freedom mean when the men who fought for it would never experience it? What was the point of winning if the price was so high? These are uncomfortable questions. They do not fit the narrative of righteous victory, but they are real questions that deserve real answers. The answer, perhaps, is that war is always tragedy, even when necessary, even when justified, even when won. The death of young men in combat is always loss, always waste, always grief. We can honor their sacrifice. We can recognize their courage. We can appreciate the freedom they died to preserve. But we cannot pretend that their deaths were not terrible. We cannot romanticize war into something noble and glorious. War is ugly and brutal, and it destroys the best among us. The 4 men who died on August 15, 1945, were the best among us. They volunteered to serve. They trained to fly. They faced danger repeatedly. They did their duty even when they were exhausted and scared and desperate for it to be over. They flew one more mission when they could have stayed on the carrier. They followed orders even though the war was ending. They fought when attacked even though fighting seemed pointless. They gave everything they had, and it killed them. Their sacrifice should be remembered not because it was glorious, but because it was real. Because they were real people with real lives that were cut short. Because their families suffered real grief that lasted for decades. Because their deaths reveal something true about the nature of war that we must never forget. War does not end cleanly. It does not stop when we want it to. It claims victims until the very last second. And sometimes the last victims are the ones we remember most, not because their deaths mattered more than the millions who died before them, but because they died when it seemed like dying should no longer be necessary. If there is meaning to be found in the last dogfight of World War II, it is this. War is always present tense. It does not care about past or future. It exists only in the moment. And in that moment, men are fighting and dying regardless of what politicians have decided or what historians will write. The war was over on August 15, 1945, in Tokyo and Washington and London, but it was not over in the skies above Tokyo at 6:45 in the morning. In that place, at that time, the war was very much alive, and it killed with the same efficiency it had demonstrated for 6 years. We remember the last dogfight of World War II not to glorify combat or celebrate violence. We remember it to honor 4 men who died when they should have lived. We remember it to acknowledge the families who lost fathers and sons and husbands. We remember it to understand that war's end is not instantaneous, that victory does not prevent tragedy, that even in the moment of triumph, there is loss. We remember because forgetting would be the final injustice. These men died. They should not also be forgotten. The sky above Tokyo on the morning of August 15, 1945, witnessed the last act of a terrible drama that had played out across the globe for 6 years. Millions had died, cities had been destroyed, entire nations had been devastated, and now, in the first moments of peace, 4 more men fell from the sky. Their deaths changed nothing about the war's outcome, but they changed everything for the people who loved them. That is the final lesson of the last dogfight. Every death is absolute, every loss is total, and peace, when it finally comes, does not resurrect the dead.